I had little social or romantic experience when I entered into an arranged marriage. The man I married was the son of a small to medium-sized company's president. My family also owned a small business with a few dozen employees. Our parents probably met somewhere and, realizing they had children of marriageable age, arranged our meeting. I lost my mom when I was young, and my dad raised me alone. Being an only daughter, he was concerned about my future and somewhat forcefully arranged the marriage. As for me, I was shy and not very good at making friends. After graduating high school, I started working at my dad's company. I had no part-time job experience and never went out at night. I wasn't interested in romance, so the idea of an arranged marriage actually suited me. I had a crush during my school days but never dated anyone. The only men I interacted with were my dad and the male employees in their 40s at our company. Having almost no experience in love, I thought I couldn't possibly get married. However, I was lucky to have this arranged marriage opportunity, and I wanted to put my dad at ease, so everything went smoothly and led to marriage. My husband was 3 years older than me, but looked much younger. He also joined his dad's company after high school and was expected to become its president. The business was doing well, and, as it turned out, he was quite my type. I fell for him at our first meeting but couldn't make the first move. To my surprise, he proposed during our second meeting alone. Overwhelmed with joy, I happily accepted. And so, after just 2 meetings, we got married, and he became my husband. Our married life began in his parents' home. He wanted to stay close to observe his dad's work, as he would eventually take over the company. I moved in with my husband's parents as per the arrangement. My in-laws were delighted that I could live with them, which I knew would reassure my dad. But this feeling was short-lived, starting from the second day of our marriage. I lost my mother when I was young, so I can do all kinds of household chores. Well, I thought I could. That morning, as I went down to make breakfast before my husband woke up, I found my mother-in-law, Grace, already awake. "Oh, good morning. You're late. Have you cleaned the entranceway yet?" I was surprised. It was only 6 a.m. "I'm sorry, I'll quickly clean the entranceway," I said, rushing to sweep the front door area. So, cleaning the entrance is a morning routine in my husband's house. I resolved to wake up earlier from the next day. Then, I prepared breakfast for 4, but my husband didn't come down for until 7 a.m. Instead of eating right away, he lay on the sofa watching TV. "You should first serve coffee and the newspaper when your husband wakes up," Grace said, while eating her breakfast, startling me. "I apologize," I responded, handing my husband his coffee and the newspaper. He didn't even look at me, just drank his coffee and read the paper. I really need to learn more. I reflected on my lack of experience and tried harder from the next day. Initially, I attributed Grace's constant nagging to my inexperience and followed her instructions. Eventually, when our daughter was born, I had to juggle childcare with everything else. Grace never interfered in household or childcare matters, continuing her relentless criticisms. I kept telling myself it was due to my immaturity. One day, unable to bear Grace's constant complaints, I appealed to my husband. "Grace criticizes me every day. I can't stand it," I said in tears. However, my husband dismissed it. "It's your fault," he said indifferently. Feeling like I was about to break, I said, "I know I have my faults, but Grace goes too far. She uses me as her outlet for stress. I want you to talk to her." I was on the brink of breaking down, mentally and physically. But my husband's response was shocking. "I married you despite your immaturity. Mom is trying to make you a proper adult. Can't you see that?" He retorted angrily. "Even so, Grace's behavior is excessive," I argued. Suddenly, he became calm and said, "If you speak ill of Mom, let's get a divorce. Go back to your parents' house." He left the room. I couldn't comprehend his words at first. But as I calmed down, the reality of his words and the thought of divorce crossed my mind. Anticipating Grace's intervention, I decided to return to my parents' house for the time being. The next day at my parents' house, I received divorce papers from my husband. I resolved to go through with the divorce. However, my dad opposed it. He must have been upset about his only daughter getting divorced so soon. I explained the situation earnestly, but he only advised me to endure. Now that I think about it, Dad was always lenient with his mother, but strict with Mom. Perhaps he was also concerned about appearances when his daughter returned home after a divorce. In the end, Dad took me back home, where I apologized to my husband and Grace, and things went back to how they were. But since then, Grace's criticisms escalated. One day, as I was busy with household chores, "Coffee," Grace said. Surprised, I replied, "Yes," and served her coffee. It was the first time Grace had asked me for something, though my husband often did. I usually did the cooking, cleaning, and tidying up, but had never been asked to bring coffee or anything else. Maybe she's tired? I thought at the time, but then it continued the next day and the day after. "Coffee, newspaper." She would just sit on the sofa, not moving at all. I started wishing she would do these things herself, but then, during a meal, "Oh, today's seasoning is too strong. Are you trying to make us sick?" she said. I replied, "I'm sorry, I'll remake it." But she said, "No, it's okay. It would probably be the same anyway," eating her meal while clearly complaining. I had been criticized for my seasoning before, but this time she added spiteful comments. I was a bit angry but could only apologize. "I'm terribly sorry. I'll be more careful in the future." I apologized again. My husband and father-in-law, Daniel, seemed unconcerned, laughing while watching TV. Only my daughter looked at me with concern. Honestly, I didn't want her to see me being scolded. That's why, even when Grace criticized me, I would just say, "Understood," and try to ignore it. But perhaps that bothered her. Her criticisms began to extend to my daughter. "It's the parent's fault if the child doesn't have manners. Since the parent lacks manners, the child becomes ill-mannered too," she would say loudly in front of my daughter. That was too much. "Please, Grace, could you speak a little softer?" I asked, but she became hysterical. "You're the one who raised her that way. I'm just trying to teach her properly, and you're making me out to be the villain?" she screamed. Even my husband finally noticed and asked, "What's going on?" But when I explained, he said, "Well, you can't blame her," defending Grace. From then on, Grace would call me over for any little thing and berate me. In my younger days, I thought it was my inadequacies that upset Grace. Now, I realize it's different. She just wants to torment her daughter-in-law. Realizing this, I gradually started to feel a sense of disgust towards Grace. However, as long as we lived together, I had to see her face every day. Whenever I mentioned wanting to visit my parents, "Planning to neglect your duties here? You've become quite presumptuous," she would complain. Fearing her complaints if I went back home without permission, I hardly ever returned after getting married. During this time, my real dad passed away in a traffic accident. It was so sudden that I was in shock, but I couldn't listen to Grace's nagging anymore and rushed to my family home. I was too busy to remember what happened next. My dad's business collapsed, unable to recover after his sudden death. The company's lawyer, a friend of Dad's, handled all the paperwork, allowing me to stay beside Dad's portrait. Then, unexpectedly, the lawyer informed me of an inheritance from Dad. Being an only child, some real estate was left to me even after paying the final salaries to the employees. Despite my limited contact with him after marriage, Dad had always been concerned about me. Mixed feelings of happiness and regret for not being able to return home earlier overwhelmed me, and I couldn't stop crying. The inheritance amounted to a substantial sum of $1.2 million. I was surprised by the amount, but my husband's reaction was even more striking. He accompanied me to hear the will, unable to hide his delight even though it was right after Dad's death. His mind seemed entirely preoccupied with the inheritance. I looked at him and felt the same disgust I had for Grace. He had ignored my struggles with Grace, never helped with childcare or Daniel's company, just idly spent his days at home. I vowed to myself, who says I have to give him the inheritance? And began to contemplate a plan. As expected, when everything was settled and I returned home, Grace was waiting. Instead of her usual complaints, "You must be exhausted, take some rest." And she spoke to me in a way she never had before. In the decades since our marriage, I had never once received words of comfort from her. I was speechless at her sudden change, but her next words made everything clear. "By the way, I heard your dad left you an inheritance." I realized then. Grace was after my inheritance. I realized that my feelings had progressed from anger to hatred. Trying to hide my emotions, I calmly said, "Yes, that's right," while suppressing my loathing. "We'll be busy now. Our company needs rejuvenating." Grace mentioned eyeing my inheritance as a means to revitalize their business. The fact that she could discuss such matters so soon after my dad's passing shocked me. "Yeah, the car's been acting up lately too." My husband chimed in, clearly in a good mood. The thought of both Grace and my husband talking like this intensified my hatred. Sensing something was off, my daughter suggested, "Mom, let's take a break," and led me to our room. Thanks to her, I managed to escape the situation. From then on, Grace stopped her nagging, and she and my husband would excitedly discuss plans for reviving the company and look at catalogs for new cars. I suppressed my hatred as I went through each day. In a bold move, they even appointed my husband as the president of the company. He began spending lavishly, giving bonuses to employees and investing in new equipment without restraint. The employees, initially puzzled, soon praised the new president as they benefited from his generosity, and the company buzzed with new life. Even our home gradually underwent renovations, with new appliances for household chores. For a moment, I thought that maybe, if life continued like this, free from criticism and relatively peaceful, it might be bearable. But when I thought of decades of mistreatment and the way Grace and my husband were using that inheritance as if it were their own, my hatred returned, stronger than ever, and I knew I had to execute my plan. The day to put my plan into action arrived. That day was the company's recreational trip. They had never mentioned such a trip before, but this time they decided to take all the employees. Of course, I was not taken along. My husband and in-laws left cheerfully. As soon as they departed, my daughter and I began our plan. We had a moving truck ready, which filled with our packed belongings and moved to an apartment I had secretly bought. After Dad's death and my return home, my daughter and I had discussed and decided to buy an apartment to live in just the two of us. We had slowly acquired furniture for our immediate needs. Previously, Grace's watchful eye would have made it impossible for me to live freely. However, recently she had become more outgoing, and when I went out, she didn't complain but saw me off without a word. I had been shopping with my daughter for furniture and appliances for our new home. She surprisingly agreed to the plan. Typically quiet and reserved like me, she rarely spoke at home, only discussing her school life occasionally. She had always known about Grace's bullying and had supported and defended me. Grace's mood swings often affected her too, which is why she agreed to the plan. I had been mostly forbidden by Grace to go out with my daughter, as she claimed it would neglect the household chores. Now, being able to shop together and visit apartments, I felt truly happy. My husband and in-laws, unaware of this, must have been enjoying their trip. I regretted that I would not be able to see their surprised faces when they returned the next day. And then they came back from the trip in high spirits. I don't know what happened after that. The day after they returned from the trip, I received an angry call from my husband. "What are you doing? Where are you?" he shouted. "I can no longer live with your family. That's why I left the house. My daughter is with me." I calmly replied. "I've been sporting your immaturity all this time." His words confirmed he had always looked down on me. So, he never said or did anything, even though he knew Grace was bullying me. I regretted not seeing his true nature despite years together. But now, I feel no affection for my husband. "I won't accept this," he keeps saying. "You are now a stranger to me," I replied. "What are you saying? We haven't even signed divorce papers." He laughed, but I had the last laugh. "You had gave me the divorce papers, remember? Grace's name was even written as a witness." In fact, I had the divorce papers. Previously, when I was driven out of the house, the divorce papers had been sent to my parents' home, and I kept them hidden instead of throwing them away. After Dad died, I had filed the divorce papers as part of my plan. In reality, we had been strangers for a long time. His response was silence. Then I heard Grace's familiar voice. "Do you realize what you've done? This is a crime." Grace's voice, always scolding me, echoed in my ears. I calmly replied, "It's not a crime, Grace. You were the witness on the divorce papers." "That's a story from the past. To bring that up now!" Grace shouted and hurled insults at me. "I've endured your constant nagging every day. Even when you gave me divorce papers, I tolerated it and continued to live. But now, you're using the inheritance Dad left me for various expenses, aren't you?" "Well, that's..." Grace tried to make excuses, but I interrupted her. "I'm done with that kind of life. Fortunately, there were the divorce papers. Since they were never filed, I went ahead and submitted them. Is that a crime?" Grace was speechless. I concluded, "Thank you for everything. I'll be living with my daughter now. Take care of yourself," and hung up. That marked the end of a long period of revenge. As I expected, my ex-husband and former in-laws faced consequences. The money spent on reviving the company, buying new cars, and living lavishly turned into debt, and eventually the company collapsed. They apparently couldn't repay the money and even had to sell the family home. My ex-husband, unable to find stable work, resorted to part-time jobs. Grace turned to alcohol and was eventually hospitalized with suspected dementia. As for me, even though I have the inheritance Dad left, I didn't want to take it easy and instead gained experience working part-time. Having married through an arranged marriage and living without any knowledge of society, it was tough at first, but now I enjoy the satisfaction of earning my own money and my days are fulfilling. My daughter secured a job and is busy working. Having married through an arranged marriage and endured many hardships, I want her to experience life, find good opportunities, and choose a partner that suits her. I'm now living life for myself, enjoying it in a way I never did before.